They arrived at dawn, without warning, without mercy. In 60 seconds his childhood ended, and an ocean of suffering began. His name is Olaudah Equiano. This is a story that can never be forgotten. Hello, my friends. This is Malik Jefferson, narrator of Slave's Revenge. And today you will hear a story that will touch every part of your heart. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. It's always exciting to know how far our stories reach. Get ready because the excitement begins now. The morning air in Osaka was sweet, with the scent of yam fields and palm wine fermenting in clay pots outside the compound. Olaudah was 11 years old, and the world he knew was small but infinite. Bounded by the red earth paths between his village and the next, by the stories his mother told at night, and by the rhythms of the talking drums that carried news across the hills of Igboland. His father was an elder, a man of respect. Their compound was large, with high mud walls, and a central courtyard where his mother ground cassava and his sister Afe helped prepare the evening meal. Olaudah had 6 brothers and 1 sister, and though he was among the youngest, he carried himself with the pride of a child born into honor. They were Igbo, they were free, they knew nothing of chains. That morning his parents had gone to work in the distant fields, leaving only Olaudah and Afe to guard the compound. The compound walls were high, the gate was strong, and they had done this many times before. There was no fear in their hearts. They played, they laughed, they did not know that men were watching. They came over the walls like shadows given flesh. 2 men, strangers. Their faces were unfamiliar, their eyes cold and calculating. Before Olaudah could shout, before he could run, rough hands clamped over his mouth. Afe screamed once, a sound cut short by a blow that sent her sprawling to the ground. The boy fought, he bit, he kicked, but he was a child and they were men who had done this before. They bound the children's hands with rope that cut into their wrists. They gagged them with cloth that tasted of sweat and smoke. And then they dragged them out of the only home they had ever known, through the back gate, into the forest that had always seemed so friendly and now loomed like the mouth of a demon. They walked for hours. Olaudah's legs ached. His throat burned from the gag. Afe stumbled beside him, her eyes wide with terror and confusion. The men spoke in low voices, in a dialect the children could barely understand, discussing prices and markets as if they were goats being led to slaughter. When night fell, the kidnappers tied them to a tree and slept in shifts, one always watching to ensure they did not escape. For days, they moved deeper into unfamiliar territory. The landscape changed. The villages they passed were silent, their people turning away as the children were dragged through. Some looked at them with pity, others with cold indifference. This was not new to them. Children disappeared. It was the way of things now, in this time when the coastal kingdoms had learned that human flesh could be traded for iron bars, guns, and cloth. On the 6th day, they separated the siblings. Olaudah never saw Afe again. They pulled her away, screaming his name, and he screamed hers, but the gags muffled everything into pitiful whimpers that disappeared into the humid air. That was the first death, not of the body, but of the soul. The part of him that had been a brother, a son, a child of Esaka, began to die that day. Olaudah was sold, then sold again. He passed through the hands of merchants and middlemen, each transaction moving him closer to the coast, closer to something he could not yet imagine. The journey was a blur of different compounds, different languages, different faces looking at him with appraisal rather than compassion. He was weighed. He was inspected. His teeth were examined like those of a horse. He learned that he was no longer Olaudah, son of an elder. He was cargo. The first time he saw the ocean, he thought he was looking at the edge of the world. The water stretched endlessly, meeting the sky in a line so distant it seemed impossible. And there, anchored in the bay like a floating fortress, was the ship. Even from the shore he could smell it, a stench so profound, so unnatural, that his stomach heaved. It was the smell of death, of decay, of humanity compressed beyond the limits of endurance. They herded the captives into canoes, dozens of them, all children and young adults, all bound and terrified. The white men on the ship had skin the color of sun-bleached bone, and eyes like cold blue stones. They shouted in a language Olaudah had never heard, harsh and guttural, and their hands were rough as they pulled the captives aboard. Some tried to resist. They were beaten with ropes and clubs until they lay still on the deck, bleeding and broken. Olaudah was pushed below deck, down a narrow ladder into a space that should not have existed. The hold was not designed for human habitation. It was a tomb for the living. The ceiling was so low that standing was impossible. The space was divided into shelves, wooden platforms barely 2 feet apart, where they were packed side by side, body against body, with no room to turn, no room to breathe. The heat was suffocating. The air was thick with the stench of excrement, vomit, sweat, and death. He was chained to the platform by his ankle, the metal cutting into his skin with every movement. On one side of him lay a man who wept silently, tears running down his face into the filth beneath them. On the other side was a boy younger than Olaudah who had stopped moving entirely, his eyes open but seeing nothing. The young Igbo boy did not know if the child was alive or dead. In that place, the difference seemed insignificant. The ship began to move. The gentle rocking became a violent heaving as they left the coast behind. The sounds were unbearable, the creaking of wood, the shouts of sailors above, and beneath it all, the constant moaning and crying of hundreds of souls trapped in darkness. Some prayed to gods who seemed deaf, others screamed until their voices gave out. Many simply closed their eyes and waited for death. Olaudah learned quickly that death was a frequent visitor. Every morning, the sailors would come below deck with lanterns, walking among them, checking for those who had died in the night. They dragged the bodies up to the deck with no ceremony, no respect, and threw them overboard into the endless blue. He heard the splashes. He counted them. On some days, there were 5. On others, more than 10. The ocean was feeding on them. The Middle Passage, they called it. A passage to where? To what? All Olaudah knew was darkness, pain, and the slow dissolution of everything he had been. Time lost meaning. Days blended into nights. He no longer remembered what solid ground felt like, what fresh air tasted like, what it meant to stand upright and walk freely. His body became a collection of aches and wounds. His mind retreated to memories of Issachar. His mother's voice, his father's steady presence, the taste of roasted plantains, the feeling of red earth beneath his bare feet. But even memories could not sustain him forever. Hunger gnawed at his belly. They fed the captives twice a day, a handful of beans and rice, sometimes with water so foul it made them sick to drink it. Many refused to eat, choosing starvation as their escape. The sailors forced food into their mouths with metal devices that pried jaws open and poured gruel down their throats. Resistance was futile. They would keep the cargo alive long enough to sell them. After that, their lives were no longer their concern. Olaudah witnessed horrors that language cannot capture. A woman who threw herself overboard during their brief moments on deck, choosing the ocean's embrace over continued captivity. A man who died screaming from an infection that turned his leg black and swollen. Children who simply stopped breathing in the night, their small bodies carried away like discarded refuse. And through it all, the ship moved forward, cutting through the Atlantic waves, carrying them toward a destination none of them could imagine. Somewhere in that darkness, in that floating hell, something inside the boy changed. The child who had played in the compound courtyard in Issachar was gone, dissolved in salt water and suffering. What remained was something harder, something that had learned the first and most brutal lesson of this new world. Survival required the death of innocence. To live, he would have to become someone else, someone who could endure the unendurable, someone who could swallow rage and grief and still draw breath. The ocean had no mercy. The men who had built this ship, who had designed this system of human cargo, had no mercy. But deep within him, in a place they could not reach with their chains and whips, a small flame still burned. It was not hope. Hope was too fragile for this place. It was something more primal. It was the stubborn refusal to let them erase him completely. His name was Olaudah Equiano. He was stolen from his homeland. He was chained in darkness. He was reduced to merchandise, counted and catalogued like sacks of grain. But he was not yet broken. The Atlantic would try, the auction blocks would try, the plantations would try. They would all try to break him, to silence him, to make him forget that he had ever been free. They would fail. Though he did not know it yet, though the knowledge was still years away and buried beneath oceans of pain, he would survive. And one day he would speak. Not just for himself, but for every soul who had died in the dark belly of ships like this one, for every child torn from their mother's arms, for every man and woman who had chosen death over bondage. The ocean roared around them, indifferent to their suffering. But the ocean could not last forever. Somewhere ahead was land. Somewhere ahead was whatever came next. And Olaudah, against all odds, would live to see it.
Between 1750 and 1866, insurance companies in America and Britain offered policies specifically for enslaved people. Ship owners insured their cargo during the Middle Passage, and plantation owners insured enslaved workers against death or injury. These policies treated human beings as financial assets, calculating their monetary value based on age, health, and skills. Some of the largest insurance companies operating today, including Aetna and New York Life, profited from these policies. In 2000, California passed a law requiring insurance companies to disclose their historical involvement in slavery, revealing that major firms had issued thousands of such policies, viewing human suffering as an acceptable business risk.
After weeks that felt like years, the ship's movement changed. The constant rolling became less violent, and through the cracks in the deck above, Olaudah could hear the sailors shouting with what sounded like relief. They were approaching land. For many in the hold, this news brought no comfort. They had learned that the end of one torment merely signaled the beginning of another. They brought the captives up on deck in groups, blinking against sunlight that seared eyes that had known only darkness for so long. Olaudah's legs would not support him properly. He stumbled, nearly fell, and was caught by rough hands that shoved him forward. The air, oh, the air, even tinged with salt and the ship's persistent stench, it was sweeter than anything he had tasted in weeks. He gulped it down, his lungs expanding painfully. Around him, his fellow captives looked like walking corpses. Skin stretched tight over bones, eyes hollow and distant, bodies covered in sores and filth. They had left the coast of Africa as human beings. They arrived in Barbados as something else, broken, diseased, traumatized beyond measure. The sailors hosed them down with seawater, washing away the worst of the filth, but none of the shame, none of the horror. Barbados emerged from the blue like a fever dream. Green hills, white sand, palm trees swaying in the breeze. It looked like paradise. It was hell with pleasant scenery. As they anchored in Bridgetown Harbor, Olaudah could see the docks teeming with activity. Ships unloading cargo, merchants haggling, and everywhere, black faces bent under the weight of labor, moving in choreographed patterns of servitude. They kept the captives on the ship for 2 more days, feeding them better food, allowing them to wash more thoroughly. This was not mercy. This was preparation for market. They were fattening livestock before sale, ensuring the merchandise looked presentable enough to command good prices. Olaudah learned this from an older man who spoke some English, picked up from a previous owner. His name was Kwame, and his eyes held the dead certainty of someone who had been sold before. "They will separate us," Kwame said quietly as they sat on the deck, awaiting their fate. "They will look at your teeth, your muscles, your skin. They will decide what you are worth." Do not resist, do not fight. You cannot win, and they will make an example of you. What happens after? Olaudah asked, his voice hoarse from disuse. Kwame looked at the boy with something that might have been pity. You work, you obey, you survive if you can, or you die, and they replace you with the next ship's cargo. We are endless to them, inexhaustible. The auction took place in a large yard near the docks, surrounded by wooden fencing that reminded Olaudah sickeningly of cattle pens. They herded them inside, nearly 300 who had survived the crossing. Others from different ships were already there, standing in silent resignation or weeping quietly. The air was thick with fear and the oppressive heat of the Caribbean sun. The buyers came like vultures to a carcass, white men in fine clothes, carrying ledgers and speaking in that harsh English tongue Olaudah could not yet understand. They walked among the captives, touching them, prodding them, examining them with the clinical detachment of purchasers evaluating livestock. Hands gripped Olaudah's arms, testing muscle. Fingers forced his mouth open, checking teeth. Eyes appraised him with cold calculation, determining his value in pounds sterling and labor potential. The boy stood as still as he could, his heart hammering in his chest, trying to understand what was happening through the chaos of foreign words and alien customs. A man in a cream-colored suit and wide-brimmed hat stopped before him. He was perhaps 40, with weathered skin and eyes that held no warmth. He spoke to his companion, gesturing at Olaudah, and the boy caught fragments: young, healthy, field work, good investment. But Olaudah was not purchased that day. As the sun climbed higher and the auction proceeded, he watched dozens of his shipmates led away by their new owners, chains changed but not removed, faces resigned to their fate. A mother was separated from her child. Her screams cut through the yard's noise like a knife, and when she tried to run to her son, she was struck down by a guard's club. The child was perhaps 6 years old. He watched his mother dragged away, too shocked even to cry. This was Olaudah's introduction to the New World's casual cruelty. This was the system that would define the next years of his life. Not merely the physical bondage, but the systematic destruction of human connections, the deliberate severing of every bond that gave life meaning. They did not just steal labor, they stole identities, families, histories. By late afternoon, perhaps 50 captives remained unsold. They were the youngest, the smallest, those deemed less suitable for the brutal fieldwork that dominated plantation life. A merchant named Campbell purchased them as a lot, a bulk buy, cheaper per head. They were loaded onto a smaller boat and transported to a holding facility, a warehouse where they would wait for the next opportunity to be sold. The warehouse was marginally better than the ship's hold. At least they could stand. At least there were windows that let in light and air. But the chains remained, and the fear remained, and the terrible uncertainty of not knowing where they would be sent or what would be demanded of them. Olaudah spent 3 weeks in that warehouse, learning his first English words from the guards who occasionally spoke to them. Sit, stand, eat, be quiet. He also learned about the island from Kwame, who was being held for resale after his previous owner had died. Kwame told him about the sugar plantations that dominated Barbados, vast fields where enslaved people worked from dawn until long after dark, cutting cane in the brutal sun. He told Olaudah about the boiling houses where the cane was processed, where accidents were common and often fatal. He told him about the mortality rates. New arrivals often died within their first year, their bodies unable to adapt to the work, the climate, the disease. But you, Kwame said, looking at Olaudah thoughtfully, you are small, young. They will not send you to the fields yet. Perhaps you will be house slave or learn a trade. This can save your life. Olaudah did not feel saved. He felt hollowed out, emptied of everything that had made him who he was. At night, he dreamed of Esaka. He dreamed of his mother's face, his father's voice, the laughter of his siblings. He woke to reality's crushing weight, to chains and uncertainty, to a future that stretched ahead like a dark tunnel with no visible end. His sail came suddenly. A naval officer arrived at the warehouse, a Lieutenant Michael Henry Pascal of the British Royal Navy. He was looking for young boys to serve aboard his ship, the Industrious Bee. He walked through the warehouse, examining the captives with a critical eye, and stopped before Olaudah. He asked the boy's age through an interpreter. Olaudah told him 11. Pascal nodded, satisfied, and pointed at him and 2 other boys. "These 3, he said. "Clean them up and have them ready by evening." Just like that, Olaudah's destination changed. No negotiation, no choice. His life's direction altered by a pointing finger and a few words in a language he barely understood. They removed his chains, gave him clothes, rough canvas trousers and a shirt, and led the 3 boys to the docks where a longboat waited to transport them to Pascal's ship. As they rowed away from Barbados, Olaudah looked back at the island, at the green hills and white beaches that concealed such horror. He did not know then that he was fortunate. Service in the Royal Navy, however harsh, would prove far less brutal than life on a sugar plantation. He did not know that Pascal, though he treated him as property, would also ensure he received an education. He did not know that the skills he would learn aboard British warships would eventually enable his freedom. All he knew in that moment was that he was being carried further from everything he had known, deeper into a world he did not understand, toward a future he could not imagine. The ocean stretched around them, that same ocean that had already taken so much, and he wondered if there would ever be an end to the taking, if he would ever again feel solid ground beneath his feet and know that he was standing on it freely. The Industrious Bee was smaller than the slave ship, but maintained with military precision. The crew was perhaps 60 men, mostly English with a few Scottish sailors. They looked at the 3 African boys with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. They were oddities aboard a warship, purchases made by Pascal for reasons the common sailors did not fully understand. Pascal renamed Olaudah immediately. The boy's Igbo name was deemed too difficult, too foreign for English tongues. He became Gustavus Vasa after the Swedish king. It was another theft, another erasure. His name, like his freedom, like his family, was taken from him and replaced with something that served his master's convenience. But in his heart, in the private spaces they could not touch, he remained Olaudah Equiano of Osaka. Life aboard the Industrious Bee was a strange new education. The ship operated on rigid schedules and harsh discipline. Sailors who failed in their duties were flogged. Orders were barked and instantly obeyed. The sea was unforgiving, and so were the men who sailed upon it. But for Olaudah, this structured brutality was almost comprehensible compared to the chaos and terror of the Middle Passage. Pascal assigned him to work under Richard Baker, a young American sailor who showed him unexpected kindness. Baker taught him basic English, showed him how to tie knots and handle rope, explained the workings of the ship. It was the first genuine human connection Olaudah had experienced since being torn from his home, and he clung to it desperately. Baker never treated him as fully equal. The racial hierarchies of the time made that impossible. But neither did he treat him with the casual cruelty that characterized most interactions between white sailors and the African boy. The ship sailed to England, and Olaudah saw London for the first time in the spring of 1757. The city was vast beyond imagination, a sprawling mass of buildings and streets and people. The Thames River was crowded with vessels of every description. The air smelled of coal smoke and sewage and the thousand industries of empire. For a boy from a small Igbo village, it was overwhelming, a sensory assault that left him dizzy and disoriented. Pascal kept him close during their time in London, using him as a personal servant. Olaudah cleaned the lieutenant's quarters, ran errands, learned to navigate the city's confusing streets. He also began to learn to read. picking up letters and words from signs and from the brief lessons Baker gave him during quiet moments. Education was not part of his duties, but Olaudah pursued it with desperate hunger. He understood even then that knowledge was a form of power, a tool that might someday serve his freedom. The ship returned to sea, and Olaudah's education continued in a different form. The Industrious Bee was a warship, and Britain was at war with France. The 7 Years' War raged across Europe and the Atlantic, and Olaudah found himself in the midst of naval battles that terrified and amazed him. The thunder of cannons, the screams of wounded men, the acrid smell of gunpowder, the sight of ships burning on the horizon, these became the backdrop of his adolescence. He witnessed the siege of Louisbourg in 1758, a major battle where British forces captured the French fortress that guarded the entrance to the St. Lawrence River. He saw men torn apart by cannonballs, saw ships sink with all hands aboard, saw the casual expenditure of human life that characterized warfare. But he also saw courage, saw men risk themselves for their comrades, saw moments of honor amid the horror. The world, he was learning, contained both cruelty and nobility, often impossibly intertwined. During these years, Olaudah began to understand his peculiar position. He was enslaved, yes, but his enslavement looked different from that of those who labored on plantations. He was learning skills, he was seeing the world, he was being educated, however informally. Pascal treated him as property, but also relied on him, valued his service. It was a contradiction that Olaudah could not fully reconcile. How could someone be both owned and trusted, both chattel and capable? In 1759, the ship participated in the siege of Quebec, another pivotal moment in Britain's war against France. Olaudah stood on deck as British forces scaled the cliffs and engaged French troops on the plains of Abraham. He heard the volleys of musket fire, saw the smoke of battle drift across the city. General Wolfe died in that battle, as did the French commander Montcalm, and their deaths seemed to underscore the arbitrary nature of fate. Great men and enslaved boys alike were subject to forces beyond their control. But through it all, through battles and storms and the grinding routine of naval life, Olaudah was changing. He was no longer the terrified child torn from Osaka. He was becoming something else. A survivor, yes, but also an observer, a student of this strange world he had been forced into. He watched how power operated, how hierarchies functioned, how some men commanded and others obeyed. He learned languages, English fluently now, some French, scraps of Portuguese. He learned to navigate not just by compass and stars, but through the complex social waters of a society built on inequality. Richard Baker died of fever in 1759, and Olaudah mourned him genuinely. Baker had been the closest thing to a friend he had known in this new world, and his death was another reminder of life's fragility, of how quickly connections could be severed. The young man was buried at sea, his body consigned to the same ocean that had swallowed so many of Olaudah's countrymen. The irony was not lost on the young African. Pascal continued to use Olaudah's services throughout the war years, and the boy became increasingly valuable to the lieutenant. He could communicate in multiple languages, understood naval operations, was reliable and competent. This value, Olaudah dimly understood, was both his protection and his danger. As long as he was useful, Pascal would keep him. But usefulness was not freedom, and the condition of his existence remained fundamentally unchanged. He was property, and property could be sold. In 1762, the war ended. The Treaty of Paris redrew the maps of empire, transferring vast territories and millions of lives from one colonial power to another. For Olaudah, the end of war meant uncertainty. What use did Pascal have for a naval servant in peacetime? Would he be sold to a plantation after all these years? Would he be returned to the West Indies, where the sugar fields still consumed enslaved lives at a terrifying rate? The answer came with crushing suddenness. In December 1762, Pascal sold him. After years of service, after surviving battles and storms, after learning to read and speak English, after becoming indispensable to the lieutenant's daily life, Olaudah was sold like a piece of furniture, like an unwanted coat, like the property he had always legally been. The betrayal was complete. Whatever trust, whatever connection he had imagined between himself and Pascal, it was revealed as illusion. He was cargo. He had always been cargo. The buyer was Captain James Doran, of the ship Charming Sally, bound for the West Indies. Olaudah, now 16 years old, found himself once again chained and transported, his brief taste of something approaching dignity stripped away in an instant. As the ship sailed from England, he stood at the rail and looked back at the receding coastline. London, where he had learned to read, where he had walked almost freely through the streets, where he had begun to imagine that his life might be more than bondage. It disappeared into the mist. The Atlantic opened before him once more, that cursed ocean that seemed determined to define his existence. He had crossed it in chains as a child. Now he crossed it again, older but no freer, his fate still subject to the whims of men who saw him as merchandise. The rage that rose in him was different from the child's helpless terror. It was colder, harder, more calculating. If freedom would not be given, perhaps it could be taken. Perhaps there was a way to buy what could not be stolen back. That thought, dangerous and desperate, took root in his mind as the Charming Sally sailed westward. He did not yet know how, did not yet see the path. But the seed was planted. Olaudah Equiano, who had survived the Middle Passage and naval warfare, who had learned to read and navigate, who had been broken and remade and broken again, was beginning to understand that survival alone was not enough. One day, somehow, he would be free. Not through the mercy of masters who had none, but through his own determination, his own cunning, his own refusal to accept that this was all his life could be. The ocean stretched endlessly around him, indifferent as always. But Olaudah was no longer the child who had first crossed these waters. He was a man now, hardened by experience, educated by suffering, and possessed of a will that years of bondage had not managed to extinguish. The struggle for freedom would be long. It would be difficult, but it would be his struggle, fought on his own terms, and that made all the difference. The West Indies greeted Olaudah with familiar horror. Montserrat, where Captain Doran brought him, was another island paradise built on human suffering. The docks of Plymouth, the island's main port, bustled with commerce, sugar, rum, enslaved bodies, all flowing through in an endless cycle of profit and pain. Olaudah watched other captives being unloaded from ships, their eyes carrying that same hollow terror he remembered from his own arrival years before. The cycle never stopped. The ships kept coming. Doran sold Olaudah to Robert King, a Quaker merchant from Philadelphia who maintained extensive business operations throughout the Caribbean. The transaction was businesslike, a matter of pounds and pence, of examined teeth and tested muscles. King paid £40 for Olaudah, a higher price than most, reflecting the boy's education, his languages, his naval experience. King was a practical man who recognized value when he saw it. The Quaker was different from Olaudah's previous owners, though the young man was cautious about trusting this difference. King operated merchant vessels, trading between the Caribbean islands and the North American mainland. He dealt in sugar, rum, livestock, and yes, enslaved people. His religion preached equality and opposed slavery in principle, yet he participated in the system, justifying his involvement with arguments about treating his enslaved workers better than others did. It was the particular hypocrisy of men who benefit from evil while deploring it. But King, whatever his contradictions, offered Olaudah something precious: opportunity. He assigned the young man to work aboard his trading sloops, serving as a deckhand and assistant to the captain. The work was hard but familiar. Olaudah knew ships, knew the sea, and he performed his duties with the competence born of years under Pascal's command. More importantly, King paid him a small wage, pennies really, a fraction of what white sailors earned, but payment nonetheless. For an enslaved man, even these small coins represented possibility. Olaudah began to calculate. If he could save his wages, if he could find other ways to earn money, if he lived frugally and invested carefully, perhaps he could accumulate enough to purchase his own freedom. King had mentioned, almost casually, that he would sell Olaudah his liberty for £40, the same amount he had paid to acquire him. It was a mountain of money for a man earning shillings, but it was a finite mountain. It could be climbed. The trading vessel sailed regular routes between Montserrat, St. Kitts, Antigua, and the ports of Georgia, South Carolina, and Virginia. Olaudah saw the breadth of the Atlantic slave economy, saw how thoroughly it had integrated itself into every aspect of colonial commerce. Sugar plantations in the Caribbean fed distilleries that produced rum. Rum was shipped north to New England and used to purchase captives in Africa. Those captives were sold in the Caribbean and American colonies. The profits purchased more goods, which purchased more people in an endless cycle of commodification. He also saw resistance. On St. Kitts, he witnessed an uprising brutally suppressed, the leaders executed in the town square as a warning to others. In Charleston, South Carolina, he heard whispers of the Stono Rebellion, an earlier revolt where enslaved Africans had killed white colonists and fought for freedom before being hunted down and slaughtered. Everywhere, beneath the surface of forced servitude, there simmered rage and defiance that occasionally exploded into violence. But Olaudah was pursuing a different path to freedom. Violence would bring only death. He had seen enough to know that enslaved people who rebelled were crushed without mercy. Instead, he would use the system's own mechanisms against it. He would earn, save, trade, and buy his way out. It required patience, discipline, and the suppression of rage that constantly threatened to consume him. Every day spent in bondage was an offense against his humanity, but every day survived was a day closer to freedom. He began trading on his own account during voyages. When the ship carried goods between islands, Olaudah would purchase small quantities of items with his saved wages, glassware, fruit, cloth, and sell them at the next port for a profit. The margins were tiny, the risks substantial, but gradually his savings grew. £3, £5, £10. Each coin was a small victory, a tiny reclamation of agency in a life defined by powerlessness. The captains of King's vessels varied in temperament. Some treated Olaudah with grudging respect, recognizing his competence and reliability. Others viewed him with contempt, resenting that an enslaved African performed tasks usually reserved for white sailors. There were beatings, insults, moments of casual cruelty that reminded him that his position was always precarious, always subject to the whims of those who held power over him. In 1763, while the ship was docked in Savannah, Georgia, Olaudah witnessed a scene that crystallized the arbitrary horror of slavery. A woman, recently arrived from Africa, was being sold at auction. She stood on the block with her infant child, both of them terrified and exhausted. The auctioneer, seeking to maximize profit, decided to sell them separately. The woman would fetch a higher price without the burden of a child, and the infant could be sold to someone willing to raise it into a future laborer. The woman's screams when they tore the baby from her arms echoed across the auction yard. She fought with the strength of desperation, but it was useless. They beat her down, subdued her, and carried the infant away. The child's cries faded into the distance. The mother collapsed, something essential broken inside her. Olaudah watched, his hands clenched into fists, his jaw tight with suppressed rage. This was the system. This was the economy. This was the civilization that called itself Christian and enlightened. He returned to the ship that evening and counted his savings. £15, 3 shillings, 4p. Still less than half of what he needed. The path to freedom stretched ahead like a desert, each step painful, each mile uncertain. But the alternative was to remain in bondage, to accept that this was all he would ever be. That was unacceptable. He would continue. He would endure. He would accumulate his coins one at a time until the weight of silver equaled the price of his humanity. Years passed in this manner, 1764, 1765, the routine of voyages, of loading and unloading cargo, of buying and selling small quantities of goods, of saving every possible penny. Olaudah became known among King's employees as reliable, competent, trustworthy. He learned to navigate the social complexities of being an enslaved man who was more educated than many free whites, who could read and write and calculate, who understood commerce and navigation. It required careful humility, a performance of subservience that masked the sharp intelligence beneath. He also began to question the religious beliefs that surrounded him. The white colonists were overwhelmingly Christian, yet they practiced slavery without apparent moral conflict. They attended church on Sunday and sold human beings on Monday. They prayed to a God who supposedly loved all humanity while maintaining a system that denied humanity to millions. The contradiction was so profound, so obvious, that Olaudah struggled to understand how they failed to see it. But some did see it. In Philadelphia, during one of the trading voyages, Olaudah encountered Quakers who genuinely opposed slavery, who had freed their own enslaved workers and worked for abolition. These were rare individuals, swimming against the tide of their society's economic interests, and Olaudah studied them carefully. They proved that the system was not inevitable, that white people could choose differently. Most did not, but some could. This knowledge was important. He also met free black people, individuals who had purchased their freedom, been manumitted by owners, or escaped to cities where they could live in precarious liberty. They worked as sailors, artisans, laborers, always vulnerable to being captured and re-enslaved, but free nonetheless. Their existence proved that freedom was possible, that the journey he was undertaking had a realistic destination. He listened to their stories, learned from their experiences, understood the challenges he would face even after purchasing his liberty. By the spring of 1766, Olaudah's savings had reached £37. So close, so agonizingly close. He needed just £3 more to reach the 40 King had promised would purchase his freedom. But earning those final pounds felt like pushing a boulder up a mountain. Every expense threatened to reduce his savings. Every setback was a potential disaster. The crucial opportunity came during a voyage to St. Eustatius, a Dutch island that served as a major trading hub in the Caribbean. Olaudah invested nearly all his available trading money in rum and glassware, betting that he could sell them for a substantial profit. The risk was enormous. If the goods were damaged, if prices had fallen, if another trader undercut him, he could lose everything and be forced to start over. The gamble paid off. He sold the entire stock for a profit of £3, 6 shillings. With shaking hands, he counted the money, added it to his savings, and arrived at the total £40, 6 shillings. He had done it. After years of grinding labor, of careful saving, of trading and calculating, he had accumulated the price of his own freedom. But could he trust King to honor the agreement? The Quaker had promised yes. But Olaudah had learned that promises made to enslaved people meant little. He had trusted Pascal, and Pascal had sold him anyway. The law protected owners, not the owned. King could take the money, pocket it, and keep Olaudah enslaved indefinitely. There was no recourse, no appeal, no justice for property claiming its humanity. Olaudah approached King with a mixture of hope and dread. They were in Montserrat, in the merchant's office overlooking the harbour. The room smelled of tobacco and paper, the tools of commerce. Olaudah presented his savings, the coins carefully wrapped, the sum laboriously calculated. "Mr. King," he said, his voice steady despite the terror in his chest, I have the £40 you named as the price of my freedom. I have earned this money through honest labour and trade. I ask that you honour your word and grant me manumission." King looked at him for a long moment. The Quaker's face was unreadable. He took the coins, counted them slowly, verified the amount. The silence stretched. Olaudah's heart hammered. Everything, years of work, dreams of freedom, the possibility of a life lived on his own terms, hung on this moment. Finally, King nodded. "Gustavus, you have proven yourself industrious and honest. I will honour our agreement. I will draw up the manumission papers." The relief that flooded through Olaudah was so intense it left him dizzy. Freedom. Real freedom. Not through escape or violence, not through a master's whim or temporary condition, but through legal manumission, through papers that would declare him a free man under law. It seemed impossible, a dream that would evaporate if he examined it too closely. The papers were prepared over the following days, proper legal documents that declared Olaudah Equiano, also known as Gustavus Vasa, to be freed from bondage, no longer the property of Robert King, henceforth a free man with all rights and privileges pertaining thereto. King signed them, a magistrate witnessed them. They were official, binding, real. On July 11th, 1766, at the age of 21, Olaudah walked out of King's office as a free man. The sun seemed brighter, the air tasted sweeter. The weight that had pressed on him for 10 years, since being torn from Essica, since the Middle Passage, since the countless sales and transfers and moments of powerlessness, that weight lifted, not entirely. The memories remained, the trauma remained. But the legal condition of enslavement, the fundamental denial of his humanity under law, was ended. He stood on the docks of Montserrat and looked out at the Caribbean Sea, that body of water that had brought him here in chains. He was free. But what did freedom mean for a black man in a world built on slavery? Where could he go? What could he do? The papers in his pocket protected him legally, but they could not protect him from the assumptions, the prejudices, the casual violence of a society that saw dark skin and assumed bondage. Olaudah decided to remain with King as a paid employee, at least temporarily. The familiar was safer than the unknown, and King offered reasonable wages for Olaudah's skills as a sailor and trader. He continued making voyages throughout the Caribbean and to the North American mainland, but now as a free man earning wages, able to leave if he chose, able to control his own labor. But freedom was more complex than he had imagined. In Savannah, a white man tried to claim he was a runaway slave, demanding he present his manumission papers. Only the documents saved him from being captured and sold. In Charleston, he was refused service at a tavern because of his race. In every port, he encountered the realities of being free in a slave society, technically liberated but socially constrained, legally recognized but culturally despised. He also began to think about his future in broader terms. What was the purpose of his freedom if he used it only for personal comfort? He had survived what had killed thousands. He had witnessed the slave trade from inside its machinery, seen its mechanisms, understood its logic. He had stories to tell, testimony to give, knowledge that could serve the cause of abolition. But he was one man, uneducated beyond basic literacy, unknown beyond the small circles of Caribbean commerce. Who would listen to him? In 1767, Olaudah decided to return to England. The decision was partly practical. London offered more opportunities than the Caribbean, but also strategic. Britain was home to a small but growing abolitionist movement, Quakers and others who opposed the slave trade on moral grounds. Perhaps there, his story might find an audience. Perhaps there, his voice might matter. He booked passage on a ship bound for London, paying his own fare from money he had earned, carrying his manumission papers like a talisman against the world's cruelty. As the ship sailed north, leaving the Caribbean behind, Olaudah reflected on the journey that had brought him here. Stolen child, Middle Passage survivor, naval servant, enslaved trader, freed man. Each stage had shaped him, taught him, prepared him for whatever came next. England, when he arrived, was both familiar and strange. He had been there before with Pascal, but as an enslaved servant, not as a free man. Now he walked the London streets with different eyes, seeing the wealth built on colonial exploitation, the fine houses purchased with sugar profits, the merchants grown rich on the trade in human flesh. The British Empire's glory was constructed on a foundation of suffering, and Olaudah had seen that foundation from below. He worked various jobs: sailor, barber's assistant, servant in wealthy households, learning more about British society, improving his education, making connections. He also sought out the Quaker community, those who had opposed slavery most consistently. They welcomed him, listened to his stories, encouraged him to write down his experiences. But writing was a daunting prospect. He could read adequately, write simple letters, but producing a book, a narrative that would convince skeptical readers of the slave trade's horror, that required skills he did not yet possess. So he studied. He read voraciously the Bible, philosophical works, travel narratives, political tracts. He attended lectures, engaged in discussions, absorbed the education that had been denied him. He also underwent a spiritual transformation, converting to Christianity and being baptized. This was partly genuine religious conviction and partly strategic. A Christian black man would have more credibility in British society than a pagan one. Everything had to be calculated, every decision weighed against its potential impact on his larger goals. Years passed. Olaudah worked, saved, traveled, and continued his self-education. He voyaged to Turkey and the Mediterranean, expanding his understanding of the world beyond the Atlantic slave routes. He attempted to join an expedition to the Arctic, fascinated by exploration and scientific discovery. He continued to work as a sailor, the profession he knew best, but always with the growing sense that his life's purpose lay elsewhere. By the 1780s, Britain's abolitionist movement had gained momentum. Public opinion was slowly turning against the slave trade, influenced by moral arguments from religious leaders and economic arguments from theorists who believed free labor was more efficient than enslaved labor. Olaudah became connected with key figures in this movement: Granville Sharp, Thomas Clarkson, others who were building a political campaign to end the trade. They encouraged him to write his story, to produce a first-hand account of enslavement that could humanize the abstract debates about commerce and morality. The British public had heard arguments about the slave trade's immorality, but they had rarely heard from the enslaved themselves. Olaudah's voice, his experiences, could provide powerful testimony that no second-hand account could match. He began writing in earnest in the late 1780s, laboriously composing his narrative with the help of abolitionist friends who edited his prose and provided guidance on structure and style. The work was difficult, emotionally draining, requiring him to revisit traumas he had tried to bury. But it was also necessary. This was his weapon against the system that had tried to destroy him. Words, testimony, truth. The book took shape slowly, painfully, like a statue emerging from rough stone. Olaudah sat at a small desk in his London lodgings, writing by candlelight, filling page after page with his memories. The memories did not come easily. Some had been buried for years, locked away because the pain of remembering was too intense. Others came flooding back with terrifying clarity: the smell of the slave ship, the weight of chains, the screams of the separated family members. He wrote about Isaka, about his childhood before the theft that had ended it. He wanted readers to understand that he had not been born into slavery, that he had known freedom, family, dignity. The Africa of European imagination was a savage wilderness populated by primitives. Olaudah's Africa was a place of culture, family structures, justice systems, trade networks, a civilization that deserved respect, not the contempt that justified its exploitation. He wrote about the Middle Passage, choosing his words carefully to convey the horror without overwhelming readers into disbelief. The conditions were so extreme, so inhuman, that describing them accurately risked accusations of exaggeration. But he had to try. How else could he make comfortable British citizens understand what their sugar and rum had cost? How else could he make them see the humanity in people they had been taught to regard as property? Writing about the auctions was particularly difficult. The memory of standing naked before buyers, of being examined like livestock, of watching families torn apart, these images haunted him. But they had to be included. The British public consumed products of slave labor while remaining ignorant of or indifferent to the mechanisms of that labor. Olaudah would strip away that comfortable ignorance. He also wrote about the contradictions he had observed, the Christian slaveholders who saw no conflict between their faith and their actions, the Enlightenment philosophers who spoke of human rights while owning human beings, the merchants who opposed slavery in principle but participated in practice because it was profitable. These contradictions were important. They showed that the system persisted not because people were genuinely convinced of its morality, but because admitting its immorality would require sacrificing enormous economic interests. The narrative took shape over months of writing, revision, and consultation with abolitionist allies. Granville Sharp reviewed sections, offering suggestions on tone and emphasis. Thomas Clarkson provided data on the slave trade's scale and mechanics. Olaudah incorporated their insights while maintaining his own voice, his own perspective. This was his story, and it needed to sound authentic, not like propaganda written by well-meaning white abolitionists. He also included his years of service to Pascal, his naval experiences, and his time working for Robert King. These sections served multiple purposes. They demonstrated his capabilities, his intelligence, his full humanity. They showed that even relatively benevolent masters still participated in an inherently immoral system, and they illustrated the path to his freedom, providing a narrative arc that moved from slavery to liberation, from powerlessness to agency. The title itself was carefully chosen, The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano, or Gustavus Vassa, the African, written by himself. That final phrase, written by himself, was crucial. Skeptics would assume a black man could not have written such a book, that it was the work of white abolitionists using him as a mouthpiece. By emphasizing his authorship, by including details that only someone who had lived these experiences could know, Olaudah established credibility. He also included religious elements, describing his conversion to Christianity and his belief in divine providence. This was partly genuine. He had found comfort in faith, but also strategic. British society was deeply Christian, and a narrative framed within Christian terms would reach more readers than one that challenged religious assumptions. He positioned slavery as a sin against Christian principles, using the language of his audience to condemn their practices. Finding a publisher proved challenging. Many were reluctant to take on a book written by a former slave, questioning both its literary merit and its commercial viability. Who would buy such a book? Would it find an audience beyond abolitionist circles? Olaudah persevered, eventually securing publication through subscription. Readers paid in advance, guaranteeing the publisher against losses. He worked tirelessly to secure subscriptions, approaching anyone who might support the project. The list of subscribers was itself a political document. It included prominent abolitionists, religious leaders, members of parliament, wealthy merchants, and ordinary citizens moved by the cause. Securing these subscriptions required Olaudah to navigate complex social situations, presenting himself as respectable and educated while not threatening white society's sense of superiority. It was a delicate balance, but he had spent years learning to manage such dynamics. The interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano was published in London in March 1789. The first edition was modest, but its impact was immediate. Readers were shocked by the first-hand account of the slave trade's brutalities. The middle passage description was particularly effective, stripping away the abstractions that allowed people to ignore the trade's reality. This was not distant suffering or theoretical cruelty. This was a specific human being describing specific horrors he had endured. Reviews were mixed. Abolitionist publications praised the book lavishly, recognizing its value to their cause. Pro-slavery publications attacked it, questioning its authenticity and accusing Olaudah of exaggeration or outright fabrication. Some critics claimed he could not have written it himself, that the prose was too sophisticated for a former slave. These attacks, ironically, increased interest in the book. People wanted to read it and judge for themselves. Olaudah embarked on a speaking tour, traveling throughout Britain to promote the book and the abolitionist cause. He spoke in churches, assembly halls, drawing rooms, anywhere people would listen. He presented himself carefully, educated, articulate, Christian, respectable, to counter stereotypes about African inferiority. His very existence challenged the ideologies that justified slavery. If a man could be stolen as a child, endure the Middle Passage, be enslaved for years, purchase his freedom, educate himself and write a compelling book, how could anyone argue that Africans were naturally inferior or suited for bondage? The speaking tour was exhausting but effective. Audiences were moved by his presence, by hearing his story in his own voice. Women wept. Men expressed outrage. Many signed petitions calling for the slave trade's abolition. Olaudah was becoming a public figure, one of the most prominent black voices in Britain, a living refutation of the lies that sustained the Atlantic slave system. The book went through multiple editions, each expanding the subscriber list and reaching wider audiences. It was translated into Dutch, German, and Russian, spreading its influence across Europe. In America, where slavery remained legal and deeply entrenched, the book was read by abolitionists, but banned or suppressed in slave states. The narrative had become dangerous, a weapon against the system it described. Pro-slavery forces fought back. They published rebuttals questioning Olaudah's account, suggesting he was actually born in the Caribbean rather than Africa, claiming his story was fabricated for abolitionist propaganda. These attacks were sometimes sophisticated, using documentary evidence to create doubt about specific details. Olaudah responded to each challenge, providing additional documentation when possible, clarifying points that had been misunderstood or misrepresented. The controversy over his birthplace became particularly intense. Critics pointed to his baptismal record, which listed his birthplace as Carolina, and to naval muster rolls that sometimes listed him as born in the West Indies. These documents seemed to contradict his claim of African birth. Olaudah explained that such records were often inaccurate, filled out by officers who made assumptions or recorded what was convenient rather than accurate. But the doubt persisted, a shadow over his narrative's credibility. Modern historians continue to debate this question, examining evidence from all sides. Some believe the documentary evidence proving Caribbean birth is conclusive. Others argue that such documents were routinely inaccurate for enslaved people, who had no control over how they were recorded. The debate is significant because it touches on questions of authenticity, representation, and who has the authority to tell slavery's story. But regardless of his birthplace, the power of Olaudah's narrative, its detailed descriptions of the slave trade, its moral arguments against slavery, its humanization of enslaved people, remains undeniable. What is certain is the book's impact. It became one of the most influential abolitionist texts of the era, cited in Parliament during debates over the slave trade, read by thousands who had never before confronted slavery's realities. It helped shift British public opinion, creating moral pressure that would eventually contribute to legal change. In 1792, Olaudah married Susanna Cullen, an Englishwoman from Cambridgeshire. The marriage was controversial. Interracial marriages were rare and socially transgressed, but Olaudah had achieved enough prominence that local opposition was muted. They had two daughters, Anna Maria and Joanna. For a man who had been torn from his family as a child, who had spent years without meaningful family connections, fatherhood was deeply significant. He was building the life that slavery had tried to prevent, creating the family that had been stolen from him. He continued his abolitionist work throughout the 1790s, even as his health began to decline. The years of hardship, the Middle Passage, naval service, constant travel, had taken their toll. But he pushed forward, writing letters to newspapers, speaking when he could, supporting the movement that was slowly, painfully making progress. The British slave trade abolition campaign gained momentum throughout the decade. William Wilberforce led the parliamentary effort, introducing bills year after year, despite fierce opposition from West Indies merchants and plantation owners. Each time, the bills were defeated by narrow margins, the economic interests outweighing moral arguments. But each defeat was narrower than the last. Public opinion was shifting. Olaudah did not live to see final victory. He died on March 31st, 1797, at the age of 52. His wife had died 4 years earlier. He was buried in London. His grave eventually lost to time, its location now unknown. But his words survived, his narrative survived, his testimony survived. And 10 years after his death, in 1807, Parliament finally passed the Slave Trade Act, abolishing the British slave trade. The bill passed the House of Commons by an overwhelming margin, a testament to the decades of campaigning by abolitionists and the shifting moral consciousness they had helped create. The slave trade that had stolen Olaudah from Osaka, that had transported millions in chains across the Atlantic, that had built fortunes and empires on human suffering, it was finally illegal under British law. The abolition was not complete. Slavery itself remained legal in British colonies until 1833. In America, it would persist until 1865, requiring a civil war to end it. And the legacies of slavery, the racism, the inequality, the trauma, would persist far longer, echoing through generations. But the 1807 abolition was a crucial step, and Olaudah's narrative had played a significant role in making it possible.
After Congress banned the importation of enslaved Africans in 1808, the domestic slave trade exploded within America. Virginia became known for slave breeding farms, where enslaved people were systematically forced to reproduce to create children who could be sold to plantations in the Deep South. Enslaved women were valued for their fertility, and many were subjected to forced pregnancies. Men were sometimes hired out as breeding stock to other plantations. Between 1808 and 1860, approximately 1 million enslaved people were forcibly relocated from the Upper South to states like Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana through this internal trade. Families were torn apart on an industrial scale, with children as young as 8 sold away from their mothers. Richmond, Virginia, became one of the largest slave trading centers in America, with auction houses operating openly in the city center.
The decades following Olaudah Equiano's death saw the gradual dismantling of the Atlantic slave trade, though the institution of slavery itself proved more resistant to abolition. His narrative continued to circulate, reprinted and read by new generations of abolitionists who found in his words both testimony and inspiration. The book had taken on a life independent of its author, becoming a foundational text in the literature of freedom. In Britain, the 1807 Slave Trade Act marked a turning point, but enforcement proved challenging. Ships continued to smuggle captives across the Atlantic, profits remaining high enough to justify the risks. The Royal Navy established the West Africa Squadron, warships tasked with intercepting slave vessels. It was grim, dangerous work. Officers boarded ships and found conditions that mirrored what Olaudah had described decades earlier: the packed holds, the disease, the death. His narrative had warned them, but the reality was still shocking. The liberated Africans rescued by these naval patrols faced uncertain futures. They were not returned to their homes. The distances and costs made that impractical. Instead, they were settled in Freetown, Sierra Leone, a colony established specifically for freed slaves. There they built new lives in a land that was African, but not their homeland, free but still subject to British colonial control. It was freedom with asterisks, liberation that came with conditions. Meanwhile, in the American South, slavery not only persisted, but expanded. The cotton gin's invention in 1793 had made cotton cultivation enormously profitable, and the demand for enslaved labor grew exponentially. Plantations spread across Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. By 1860, nearly 4 million people were enslaved in the United States, their labor producing cotton that fed textile mills in Britain and New England, generating wealth that built cities and fortunes. Olaudah's narrative was read by American abolitionists, who recognized its power but also its limitations in their context. He had purchased his freedom through years of careful saving, working within the system. But in the antebellum South, such paths were increasingly closed. Laws tightened, making manumission more difficult. Literacy among enslaved people was criminalized. The possibility of working one's way to freedom, never easy, became nearly impossible. The American abolitionist movement split into factions. Some advocated gradual emancipation, compensation to slave owners, colonization of freed blacks to Africa. Others demanded immediate abolition without compensation, arguing that slaveholders deserved nothing for surrendering stolen property. William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and others built a movement that was more radical, more urgent, more willing to challenge the fundamental structures of American society. Frederick Douglass, himself an escaped slave who wrote a powerful narrative of his experiences, acknowledged Olaudah's influence on his own work. Both men understood the power of testimony, of forcing readers to confront slavery through the eyes of those who had endured it. But Douglass also noted the differences in their circumstances. Olaudah had operated in a British context where slavery was becoming morally suspect. Douglass operated in an American context where slavery was economically essential and politically entrenched. The battle was harder, the stakes higher. Across the Atlantic, Britain abolished slavery itself in its colonies through the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833. The law freed approximately 800,000 enslaved people in the Caribbean, South Africa, and other British territories. But it also compensated slave owners for their lost property to the tune of £20 million, a massive sum, equivalent to roughly 40% of the government's annual expenditure. The enslaved received nothing. They were freed but penniless, facing societies structured to exploit their labor, whether they were legally enslaved or not. The Caribbean, in the post-emancipation era, became a complex landscape of nominal freedom and practical oppression. Former slaves were technically free to work for wages, but plantation owners controlled land, capital, and political power. They set wages low, imposed harsh labor contracts, and created systems of debt peonage that mimicked slavery in all but name. Freedom meant the right to negotiate one's exploitation, not escape from it. Some former slaves left the plantations, establishing independent communities in the Caribbean interior or migrating to cities. They built churches, schools, and mutual aid societies, creating institutions that affirmed their humanity and dignity. These communities became repositories of African cultural practices mixed with Christian traditions and Caribbean innovations, religions like Vodou in Haiti and Santeria in Cuba, musical forms like calypso and later reggae, all emerging from people forging identities in the aftermath of slavery. In Africa, the ending of the Atlantic slave trade did not end slavery itself. Arab slave trades continued in East Africa, transporting millions across the Sahara and Indian Ocean. Internal African slavery persisted in various forms. European colonial powers, even as they condemned slavery, imposed forced labor systems in their African colonies that differed little from slavery in practice. The moral arguments against slavery had been directed primarily at the Atlantic trade, not at coerced labor in general. The American Civil War, when it came in 1861, was not initially fought over slavery. President Abraham Lincoln framed it as a war to preserve the Union, not to free the enslaved. But slavery was the foundational issue, the irreconcilable difference between North and South. As the war progressed and casualties mounted, emancipation became both a moral imperative and a military strategy. The Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 declared slaves in rebel states to be free, transforming the war's purpose and inviting formerly enslaved people to join the Union cause. Nearly 180,000 black men served in the Union Army. Many of them escaped slaves who fought for their own freedom and that of those still in bondage. Their service was crucial to Union victory, providing manpower at a critical time and demonstrating African Americans' capabilities and commitment to citizenship. They fought courageously despite being paid less than white soldiers, despite facing Confederate policies that refused to treat captured black soldiers as prisoners of war, instead often executing or re-enslaving them. The Confederacy's defeat in 1865 ended American slavery. The 13th Amendment abolished it permanently, the 14th Amendment granted citizenship to former slaves, and the 15th Amendment guaranteed voting rights regardless of race. These Reconstruction amendments represented a revolution in American law, attempting to make real the promise of equality that the Declaration of Independence had proclaimed but never implemented. But the promise was betrayed. Reconstruction ended in 1877 as part of a political compromise that removed federal troops from the South. Without military enforcement, the protections for freed people crumbled. Southern states implemented black codes and later Jim Crow laws, creating a legal system of racial segregation and disenfranchisement. Sharecropping replaced slavery, trapping black farmers in cycles of debt. Violence was endemic. Lynchings, race riots, terrorism designed to maintain white supremacy through fear. The convict leasing system emerged, allowing states to rent prisoners to private companies for labor. Since black people were disproportionately arrested and convicted, often on spurious charges, this became a form of slavery by another name. Men were worked to death in coal mines, lumber camps, and turpentine operations, their labor profitable to the companies and states that exploited them. It was slavery wearing the mask of criminal justice, and it persisted into the 20th century. Olaudah's narrative continued to be read during this period, though its audience and interpretation shifted. Scholars studied it as a historical document, analyzing its depictions of 18th century slavery. Activists read it as inspiration, connecting their struggles to the long fight against bondage. Critics debated its authenticity, examining every detail for evidence of fabrication or embellishment. The book had become a contested text, its meaning and significance argued over by people with different agendas. In the 20th century, the civil rights movement drew explicit connections between slavery, Jim Crow, and ongoing racial injustice. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and Rosa Parks understood their work as continuing the unfinished project of abolition. Slavery had ended legally, but its legacies persisted. In wealth disparities created by centuries of unpaid labor, in racist ideologies developed to justify enslavement, in social structures designed to maintain racial hierarchy. The movement achieved significant legal victories: the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, that dismantled formal segregation and protected political rights. But economic inequality, residential segregation, and systemic discrimination proved more resistant to legal remedies. The civil rights movement revealed that ending slavery was easier than ending its aftermath, that legal equality was necessary but insufficient for genuine freedom. Olaudah's narrative experienced renewed scholarly interest in the late 20th century as historians began recovering and analyzing slave narratives more systematically. His book became a central text in African American literature courses, in slavery studies programs, in discussions about how history is recorded and remembered. New editions were published with extensive annotations, contextualizing his experiences within the broader Atlantic slave system. The authenticity debates continued, sometimes overshadowing the narrative's content. Scholars examined 18th century records with new methods, trying to definitively determine where Olaudah was born. Some concluded the evidence strongly suggested Caribbean birth, that he had appropriated a captivity narrative to give his abolitionist work more authenticity. Others argued the evidence was ambiguous, that inconsistent records for enslaved people made definitive conclusions impossible. But even skeptics acknowledged the narrative's value. Whether Olaudah was born in Africa or the Caribbean, his descriptions of the slave trade were accurate, consistent with other documentary evidence. His accounts of Middle Passage conditions, Caribbean slavery, and the auction system were corroborated by other sources. His moral arguments against slavery were powerful, regardless of his birthplace. The debate over authenticity, while academically interesting, was in some ways beside the point. The book's truth lay not in every biographical detail, but in its depiction of slavery's fundamental inhumanity. In the 21st century, movements like Black Lives Matter explicitly connected contemporary issues to slavery's legacies. Police violence against Black Americans, mass incarceration disproportionately affecting Black communities, persistent wealth gaps. These were understood not as isolated problems, but as manifestations of systemic racism rooted in slavery. Activists argued for reparations, for comprehensive acknowledgement of historical wrongs, for structural changes that would address centuries of accumulated injustice. Olaudah's words resonated across the centuries. His insistence on his own humanity in the face of a system designed to deny it. His refusal to accept that slavery was natural or inevitable. His transformation of suffering into testimony. These choices continued to inspire. He had taken the story the slave trade tried to erase and forced it into the historical record. He had spoken for those who died silently, whose names were never recorded, whose suffering left no trace beyond the profits it generated. Museums and memorials began grappling more honestly with slavery. In Liverpool, the International Slavery Museum opened in 2007, occupying space in a city that had been a major slave trading port. In Washington, D.C., the National Museum of African American History and Culture opened in 2016 with extensive exhibits on slavery and its legacies. These institutions presented slavery not as a distant historical curiosity, but as a foundational element of Western wealth and power, something that shaped the world we inherited. Ghana's Cape Coast Castle, where many captives passed through before the Middle Passage, became a site of pilgrimage for African diaspora people seeking to connect with ancestral history. Walking through the dungeons where people were held before being loaded onto ships, visitors confronted the physical reality of the trade. The experience was often overwhelming, the darkness, the narrow spaces, the door of no return through which captives left land for the last time. Olaudah had passed through such a place. Millions had. Their terror and suffering had happened in specific locations, on specific ships, at the hands of specific individuals pursuing profit. The question of memory became central. How should societies remember slavery? Some argued for moving past it, for focusing on progress rather than dwelling on painful history. Others insisted that honest reckoning was necessary, that ignoring history meant allowing its patterns to persist. Olaudah would have recognized this debate. He had faced similar arguments in his time, people who insisted the slave trade was a regrettable past rather than an ongoing atrocity that required immediate action. What made his narrative enduring was its refusal to let readers look away. He did not write abstractly about the institution of slavery or theoretically about moral philosophy. He wrote about specific acts of violence, specific moments of terror, specific losses that could never be recovered. He made slavery concrete, undeniable, impossible to rationalize or minimize. That was his gift to history, a voice from the inside of the machine, explaining exactly how it worked and what it cost. The legacy of Olaudah Equiano's narrative extends far beyond its immediate impact on abolitionist movements. It established a literary tradition of formerly enslaved people testifying to their experiences, using their own voices to challenge the systems that had oppressed them. This tradition would include dozens of slave narratives published in the 19th century, creating a body of literature that documented slavery from the perspective of those who endured it. These narratives shared certain features: descriptions of family separation, accounts of physical abuse, depictions of escape or paths to freedom, and assertions of the narrator's full humanity. But each also told a unique story, reflecting the diversity of enslaved experiences. Some, like Solomon Northup's 12 Years a Slave, described free black people kidnapped into slavery. Others, like Harriet Jacobs's Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, centered women's experiences, including sexual exploitation, rarely discussed in male-authored narratives. The format Olaudah helped establish, detailed autobiography emphasizing the author's intellectual and moral development, became a template for asserting black humanity against ideologies of racial inferiority. By demonstrating that formerly enslaved people could write sophisticated narratives, could analyze their experiences critically, could appeal to moral principles and literary conventions, these books refuted claims that Africans lacked the intelligence or character for civilization, but the narratives also faced constant skepticism. Pro-slavery advocates and even some neutral readers questioned their authenticity, suggesting white abolitionists had written them or that the authors exaggerated for political purposes. This skepticism reflected the core problem. A society that denied black humanity was predisposed to doubt black testimony. The narratives had to work harder to establish credibility, had to provide more evidence, had to anticipate and address objections in ways white-authored texts never did. Olaudah's inclusion of documentary evidence, his manumission papers, letters of recommendation, the extensive subscriber list, set a precedent for authentication strategies in later narratives. Authors learned to include testimony from white witnesses, to provide specific names and dates that could be verified, to frame their stories in language that resonated with white audiences while not completely accommodating white prejudices. It was a delicate negotiation, trying to tell truths that readers might not want to hear in ways that would make them listen. The 20th century saw renewed interest in these narratives as primary historical sources. Historians working to understand slavery from the inside, to document the experiences and perspectives of enslaved people themselves, turned to narratives as crucial evidence. The narratives revealed aspects of slavery that plantation records and slaveholder diaries could not. The psychological impacts, the resistance strategies, the family structures and cultural practices that persisted despite attempts to destroy them. Olaudah's narrative specifically provided insights into the Atlantic slave trade that were rare for the period. Most slave narratives focused on plantation slavery in the American South because most authors had experienced that system. Olaudah's account of the Middle Passage, of Caribbean slavery, of naval service, and of his journey to freedom through self-purchase offered perspectives that few other narratives captured in such detail. Modern DNA testing and genealogical research have opened new possibilities for connecting contemporary African diaspora people to specific African origins. While Olaudah could not definitively know where his sister ended up or what became of his family, technology now allows some descendants of enslaved people to trace their ancestry to particular regions or ethnic groups in Africa. These connections, while imperfect and partial, help address the cultural genocide that slavery represented, the deliberate severing of people from their histories, languages, and identities. The question of reparations for slavery has gained prominence in recent decades, with advocates arguing that the accumulated wealth stolen through slavery and the ongoing harms from its legacies require systemic redress. Various proposals have been advanced: direct payments to descendants of enslaved people, funding for education and housing in black communities, truth and reconciliation processes, comprehensive acknowledgement and apology. Critics argue that slavery is too far in the past, that contemporary people should not be held responsible for ancestral wrongs, that practical implementation would be impossible. But the argument for reparations rests partly on testimony like Olaudah's. Evidence that slavery was not just individual crimes, but a systematic exploitation that generated enormous wealth for some while devastating communities and individuals. The cotton that built textile industries, the sugar that filled trade coffers, the tobacco that generated plantation fortunes, all of this wealth came from unpaid labor. The people who produced it received nothing. Their descendants inherited disadvantage, while the descendants of slaveholders inherited advantage. Reparations advocates argue this imbalance demands correction. The impact of Olaudah's narrative can be measured in both direct and indirect ways. Directly, it influenced British public opinion during the crucial decades when Parliament debated abolishing the slave trade. It provided first-hand testimony that made abstract moral arguments concrete. It humanized people whom the trade had systematically dehumanized. When the 1807 Slave Trade Act passed, Olaudah's words had played a role in creating the political will for that decision. Indirectly, the narrative contributed to a broader shift in how slavery was understood and discussed. Before detailed slave narratives, slavery could be debated abstractly as a question of economics or political philosophy. After their publication, the debate had to contend with specific testimonies of specific harms. It became harder to defend slavery when confronted with the voices of those it had brutalized. The narratives made slavery's defenders engage with evidence they preferred to ignore. Educational curricula have increasingly incorporated slave narratives, including Olaudah's, as primary sources for teaching about slavery. Students read first-hand accounts rather than just secondary historical analyses, engaging directly with the voices of people who lived through the period. This pedagogical approach makes slavery less abstract, helps students understand it as lived experience rather than just historical fact. Reading Olaudah's description of the Middle Passage is different from reading a textbook summary of the slave trade, more immediate, more visceral, more affecting. The narrative has also been adapted into other media. Documentaries have featured dramatic readings of key passages. Educational videos have used Olaudah's story to explain the Atlantic slave system. Artists have created visual representations inspired by his descriptions. These adaptations extend the narrative's reach to audiences who might not read the original text, continuing its work of education and advocacy in new forms. In 2007, the 200th anniversary of the Slave Trade Act's passage, numerous commemorations occurred across Britain and the former colonies. Olaudah was prominently featured in these events, recognized as a key figure in the abolitionist movement. Statues, plaques, and exhibitions honored his memory. Schools and churches held readings of his narrative. The commemorations acknowledged not just the legal victory, but the human voices that had made it possible. Yet these celebrations were also contentious. Some descendants of enslaved people questioned whether marking slavery's abolition was appropriate. The institution had persisted decades longer, and its legacies remained. They argued for commemoration focusing on resistance and survival, rather than on the benevolence of those who finally ended something that should never have existed. Olaudah himself would likely have appreciated this critique. He never asked for praise for his owner's mercy. He testified to a system's horror and fought for its end. The ongoing relevance of his narrative lies precisely in its refusal to settle for partial freedom. Olaudah purchased his liberty legally, but he did not stop there. He could have lived quietly, avoiding the risks of public advocacy. Instead, he spent his remaining years fighting for the freedom of those still enslaved. He understood that his freedom was incomplete as long as the system that had enslaved him continued to operate. This understanding that individual liberation is insufficient while structural oppression persists resonates with contemporary social justice movements. Contemporary scholars continue to analyze the narrative from new perspectives. Literary critics examine its rhetorical strategies, its use of Christian symbolism, its navigation of audience expectations. Historians contextualize it within the broader Atlantic world, connecting Olaudah's experiences to economic histories of capitalism, political histories of empire, cultural histories of the African diaspora. Philosophers engage with its moral arguments about human dignity, natural rights, and justice. The debates over its authenticity, while sometimes frustrating, have also been productive. They have forced careful examination of historical evidence, refinement of methods for verifying 18th-century documents, and deeper thinking about what authenticity means for narratives of traumatic experience. Whether Olaudah was born in Africa or the Caribbean, whether every detail is precisely accurate or some are embellished, these questions matter for historical precision, but do not diminish the narrative's core truths about slavery's violence and injustice. What ultimately matters is that Olaudah Equiano, stolen as a child or born into slavery, forced across the Atlantic or growing up in its shadow, emerged as a voice that changed history. He took the experiences that should have destroyed him and transformed them into testimony. He refused to let slavery be only something done to him, instead making it something he could speak about, analyze, condemn, and work to end. His narrative stands as one of the most important documents of the Atlantic slave trade, a text that bridges the historical and the literary, the personal and the political. It is at once an individual autobiography and a collective testimony, Olaudah's story, and the story of millions who suffered alongside him, those who died in the Middle Passage, who were worked to death on plantations, who resisted and were crushed, who survived and passed their trauma to generations. They speak through his words as well. The narrative endures because the questions it raises endure. What does it mean to be human? How do we value human life? What obligations do we have to those whose suffering produces our comfort? How do we reckon with histories that indict our ancestors and institutions? These are not merely historical questions, they are urgent contemporary issues, and Olaudah's testimony continues to illuminate them. On a personal level, reading his narrative is an encounter with a remarkable individual, intelligent, resilient, determined, flawed, complicated. He was not a saint or a simple symbol of suffering. He was a man who made strategic decisions about how to survive and how to fight. He accommodated when necessary and resisted when possible. He learned the systems that oppressed him well enough to navigate them and eventually challenge them. His life was neither pure tragedy nor simple triumph, but something more complex and thus more recognizably human. The power of his voice across more than 2 centuries testifies to literature's capacity to preserve witness. Books can be burned, suppressed, forgotten, but words that are printed and distributed achieve a kind of immortality. Olaudah wrote himself into permanent history, ensured that his testimony would outlast him. In an era that tried to erase enslaved people's identities, reducing them to inventory and ledgers, he created a permanent record of his selfhood. That act, testifying, speaking, insisting on being heard, was itself a form of freedom. The system wanted his silence. It wanted him to accept his condition, to internalize his supposed inferiority, to believe the lies it told about him. Instead, he spoke. He wrote, he published, he traveled Britain reading his story aloud. He refused the silence that slavery demanded, and in that refusal, he claimed a freedom that no master could grant or withhold. Today, Olaudah Equiano's narrative remains in print, assigned in classrooms, cited in scholarship, read by people seeking to understand slavery's reality. His words continue to work in the world, educating, challenging, inspiring. The boy stolen from Osaka became the man whose testimony helped end the slave trade. The child who should have been erased became the author whose voice echoes through history. He was once merchandise, now he is witness, and that witness endures, speaking across the centuries to anyone willing to listen, telling truths that cannot be unlearned, bearing testimony that cannot be dismissed. His life spanned from the horrors of the Middle Passage to the triumph of abolition. His narrative documents that journey and makes its lessons available to all who follow. In the end, Olaudah Equiano achieved what seemed impossible. He turned pain into power, survival into revolution, testimony into historical force. He spoke for those who never could, ensured that their suffering was recorded and remembered, and helped create the movement that would finally end the trade that had stolen his childhood and millions of lives. His legacy is the reminder that voices matter, that testimony has power, that even those whom systems seek to destroy can speak back, and in speaking, change the world.